All right, guys, welcome back to another breakdown. As promised, this is Gervonta Davis. The first view, we're going to look at the uppercut against Santa Cruz. We've got two views, or really two angles. So that's the first angle, and this is the second angle. They're both in slow-mo, so it's really going to allow us to slow it down. But I am going to let you watch this one full speed because I don't think I'm at risk for a copyright here. So watch how quick and snappy we all know Gervonta Davis to be. Just incredible speed. All right, so let's get into the slow-mo. So the first thing I'm going to draw your attention to is his hips and his shoulders. If you've watched the video before, we talk a lot about the ability to control the hips and the shoulders and to separate them situationally. This is not something that they're doing consciously in the moment. This is a byproduct of how they've learned to move in certain situations when they're fighting. So situational fight IQ. So if you're new to the channel, draw a line between the two hip bones, and we'll pretend like that's one plane, and then draw a line between the two shoulders. So draw a line from this shoulder to this shoulder and just connect those dots. And you'll see that those planes of movement move relatively similarly here. So there's not a ton of separation. We'll go into why biomechanically that is in the second view. But I just want you to notice that a lot of his power is being rotated and generated through the hips, as we see with really good, powerful strikers like Gervonta Davis. So we see his hips moving, and we see his shoulders coming along with it. Okay, so no very minimal hip-shoulder dissociation here. The next thing I want you to look at is just the general trunk movement in relation to the rest of his body in general. When we talk about movement, we talk about movement generally in three planes. The sagittal plane, or splitting the body between right and left halves. The transverse plane, which is cutting the body kind of in top and bottom half. And then the frontal plane, which cuts the body into front and back halves. And you'll see what I mean there. I'll put up a little thing on the screen to kind of help you visualize this. But whenever we talk about movement in the sagittal plane or the transverse plane or the frontal plane, we talk about movement that's moving along or parallel to that plane. So in this case, spinal trunk extension or flexion would be in the sagittal plane. So you can see here, as he goes to hit this uppercut, he's extending his spine with the spinal erectors. Okay, there's a lot of groups of spinal erectors that travel up the spine that help extend the spine. He's also side bending or laterally flexing to the left. This would be along the frontal plane. Okay, so that's two planes of movement. And then he's obviously rotating about the transverse plane. So that trunk rotation, combination of side bending, rotation, and extension is that triplanar movement. The reason this is so important is because really good strikers, like we saw in my last video or my last breakdown with Ilia Tupuria, and then we see it with really athletic fighters like Izzy, they are really good at manipulating their center of gravity, which tends to be around that trunk region, particularly in men a little bit higher. They are really good at manipulating that in order to gain a mechanical advantage. And this is what you see Gervonta Davis doing here. It's really, really beautiful. So very minimal hip-shoulder dissociation, really good trunk movement. And then obviously we see when he makes contact here. So shift your attention here to Santa Cruz's head. This is a really good example of what we now are thinking that we understand a little bit more about that knockout, what actually happens when you hit somebody on the button. We don't think it's actually the place of contact. We think it's the motion that is derived from the contact. So it's that quick acceleration into left cervical rotation from neutral, and then decelerating and whiplashing back out. That rotational or angular acceleration causes a big stretch in those axons, which is the part of the neuron that carries signals, and creates pores, and that causes ion shifts in and out of the cell, and then it creates that hyperexcitability that causes the knockout. So really good view of just Gervonta Davis's mechanics and his ability to move, and then what causes a knockout. All right, and this view is a beautiful view to help understand why Gervonta Davis may not have needed to kind of do that hip-shoulder dissociation. Just the position of his hips and the stance, it really wouldn't have been advantageous to him. Not that he needed any more power anyway. So let's look into it. I want you to focus on his hip here. Notice how he stepped forward and started to shift weight onto that left leg. The right leg becomes a stabilizer. He's shifting his center of mass to that left leg, and he's in a relative hip internal rotation in the closed chain. And this is important because when he pivots on that leg, it gives him, since he starts in internal rotation, it actually gives him the ability to open up into external rotation. And so his hips and his shoulders really don't need to dissociate because he's got that room available to extend his hip. So he's got really good hip extension, knee extension, that triple extension that we see again when we start that kinetic chain from the ground, and it runs all the way from the hips to the lumbopelvic spine, into the thoracic spine, and then out the upper extremity. Okay, so this is a really good view of that spinal extension and then lateral flexion that we talked about in the last view. Let's move up to his shoulder blade. So since he does a really good job of maneuvering his center of gravity, he does that like lateral side bending, he's able to keep his throwing hand, the hand throwing the punch or the arm throwing the punch, really close. And the closer that you could keep it in, the more energy that you can distribute through that arm from the hips and the trunk. Okay, so you can see, so watch his shoulder blade. It's abducting away from the spine, from a muscle like the serratus anterior, which is really engaging, helps him follow through once he makes contact. And you can even see that reverberation up in the upper trap whenever he makes contact. Shows really good stability from those muscles like the upper trap, middle trap, the rhomboids, so that that shoulder blade helps deliver the upper extremity for the strike. And then a really good view here of the stretch reflex. So the pec major and the anterior delt, and maybe even a little bit of the bicep here as he winds up, definitely the bicep, because as he winds up, he's bringing his shoulder into extension, and then his wrist drops a little bit, so he's going into a little bit of elbow extension. Then his bicep catches it, essentially, switches from that eccentric to the concentric phase, along with the pec major and the anterior delt, to flex the shoulder and the elbow at the same time. Now, it's a little bit more of an isometric hold at the elbow, but he did still eccentrically load it to come up and when he winding up for that uppercut. So really good use and transfer of energy through that kinetic chain with Gervonta Davis. And this part of the reason of what makes him so special.